When's the last time your pastor preached a sermon on demons? Not metaphor for your bad habits or the enemy within, but actual, literal, spiritual beings actively working against you. Probably never. Or, if you did, it was so sanitized and distant that it felt like a fairy tale. See, modern Christianity has erased the spiritual realm. We've turned angels into Hallmark card decorations and demons into Halloween costumes. We treat spiritual warfare like it's a metaphor for resisting the urge to eat another cookie. But that is not what Jesus taught. It is not what ancient Judaism believed, and it's not what Scripture actually says. For most of recorded human history across virtually every culture on the planet, nobody was debating whether the spirit world was real. That conversation didn't exist because the answer was obvious. You can go from Mesopotamia with their Gala, demons of the underworld, Utuku, good or bad spirits depending on the day, Lamashtu. They terrorized pregnant women and infants. None of these were metaphor. They weren't psychological struggle. They were entities that required management through ritual, incantation, and the work of a trained exorcist. In ancient Egypt, you found the Aku, malevolent spirits of the restless dead, chaos demons called Seba, an entire priestly class dedicated to navigating the spirit world on behalf of the living. The Book of the Dead wasn't philosophical treatise, it was literal instruction manual for dealing with hostile entities in the afterlife. Mesoamerica, the Olmec, generally considered the mother culture of Mesoamerica, had shamanic traditions that treated the boundary between the human world and the spirit world as genuinely thin and genuinely dangerous. Their jaguar figures were not just decoration. They were meant for spiritual battle. The Toltec and later the Aztec built entire civilizations around the management of powerful spiritual forces. Tezcatlipoca was not a metaphor for evil. He was an active, unpredictable force that demanded acknowledgement. And whatever we think of it now, human sacrifice was rooted in the belief that these entities required feeding or that the world would come apart. You can go to the Shang dynasty in ancient China, roughly 1600 BC. They had ancestor spirits and malevolent spirits as active participants in their daily life. Oracle bones used for divination show consultation with the spirit realm on everything from harvests to military campaigns. The idea that this unseen world was separate from the everyday world simply did not exist. They occupied the same space. Even the fathers of rationalism, the Greeks, had a robust and earnest belief in the spirit realm. Hesiod described them as guardians, spirits of the golden age watching over humanity. Socrates spoke of his as an inner spirit that guided him. It was only later, as Greek philosophy began to bleed into early Christian thought, that they began to slide towards demon in the purely negative sense. In the Hebrew world, you would not have found the sanitized, purely monotheistic environment that we've been taught in Sunday school. They had Shadim that appear in Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 106. Lilith shows up in Isaiah. Azazel is built in the structure of Yom Kippur in Leviticus 16. The worldview of the ancient Hebrews, like their neighbors, included a populated and active spiritual realm, hostile entities included, and they all required ritual management. This pattern holds everywhere you look. The spirit world wasn't a theological debate. It was just another day. It wasn't just pagan belief that Christianity came along and corrected. The tradition Jesus himself was born into, ancient Judaism, operated inside the exact same framework, a populated, active, sometimes hostile spiritual realm. And when he showed up, he didn't dial it back. He gave instruction on how to deal with it. If you grew up in the modern church, you were probably taught that the spiritual realm is far away, not really interacting with us, and mostly symbolic, something that we really don't need to worry about. Very little is ever taught on angels and demons. But Genesis 6 talks about sons of God coming to earth and producing Nephilim, giant offspring. Ancient Jews knew exactly what this meant. Spiritual beings who rebelled came to earth, corrupted humanity, and created hybrid abominations. The Book of Enoch, which is not canon, and I'm not saying it should be canon, but it is directly quoted by Jude in the New Testament, and it gives the full story. These beings, called Watchers, taught humanity forbidden knowledge, warfare, sorcery, astrology. They corrupted everything. In Daniel, he prays, and 3 weeks later, the answer comes. Why? Because he was held up fighting the Prince of Persia, a demonic territorial ruler, and Michael had to help him. It's not metaphor, it's angelic warfare over nations. Job opens with an adversary walking into the divine council, a regular meeting where spiritual beings report to God. He's just there, part of the structure, a prosecutor figure with access to the throne room. Ancient Jews didn't question whether the spirit realm existed. They lived with the understanding that it did. When you turn to the New Testament and Jesus' teaching, you don't find him saying, actually, all that spiritual stuff, it's just metaphor. No. He amplified it. He describes demons as actual beings that wander through dry places seeking rest. When they're cast out of someone, they don't disappear. They look for somewhere else to go. And when they can't find a new host, they come back with 7 worse spirits. It's tactical information on how demons operate. Then he encounters the man possessed by legion, which means because we are many. The demons beg Jesus not to send them into the abyss. They negotiate. They ask to go into the pigs instead. They weren't an internal struggle. They were entities with personalities, agendas, and intelligence. Jesus says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Not, I saw the concept of evil emerge. In Matthew 16, he tells Peter, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. That is spiritual warfare in which we are supposed to be on offense. The early church understood this. Exorcisms were standard practice. Spiritual warfare was discussed openly. Spiritual realm was integrated into daily Christian life. So, what changed? Many people want to say the Enlightenment, but that gives the church about 16 centuries of groundwork you let them off the hook for. After the apostles, the men that came along had a little problem. They were well educated, Roman educated, Greek educated, and Greek philosophy had a very different relationship with the spirit world than Hebrew theology. Origen, one of the most influential theologians of the early church, was brilliant. He was also soaked in Platonic philosophy. And Plato's framework was about transcendence, pure spirit, pure reason. Physical world, including physical spiritual conflict, was lesser, beneath serious theological inquiry. Later on, Augustine came and cemented it. His framework dominated Western theology for 1,000 years. It still does, pretty much. But he absolutely believed in spiritual beings, but his theological emphasis was on the interior life, the soul, the will, the struggle within. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the battlefield moved from out there in the world, in the nations, in the heavens, to inside you. Your sin nature, your spiritual struggle. The cosmic war got domesticated. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380 AD, the church gained power it had never before had. And power has a way of making institutions very uncomfortable with things that can't be controlled. A Christianity where ordinary believers cast out demons and hear directly from God and operate in spiritual authority, that is hard to institutionalize, hard to control, hard to keep inside the walls of a building with a priest at the front. So, gradually, the spiritual authority that Jesus handed to every believer started getting funneled through the institution, through the priesthood, sacraments, and the hierarchy. You didn't deal with demons yourself. You went to a priest. You didn't hear from God directly. You went through the church. The spiritual realm didn't disappear. It got gatekept. In the medieval period, the church is the most powerful institution in the Western world. And Thomas Aquinas, arguably the greatest theologian of the medieval era, does something that seems harmless but has enormous consequences. He marries Christian theology to Aristotelian logic. Everything has to be systematic, rational, categorized. The spiritual realm gets organized into neat hierarchies, 9 orders of angels, clearly defined roles, tidy theological boxes, which sounds fine until you realize what got lost in the tidying. The wild, unpredictable, genuinely dangerous spirit world of Scripture, the one where demonic princes fight angels over nations and watchers leave their domain to corrupt humanity, where Jesus gives tactical intelligence about how demons operate. That doesn't fit neatly into Aristotelian categories. So it got smoothed out, systemized, and made manageable. The spiritual realm became theology instead of reality. Then there is the irony of the Inquisition. The medieval and early modern church burned people for witchcraft, for consorting with demons, for spiritual practices outside the church's control. They believed in demons enough to execute people over them, but they simultaneously suppressed the very scriptural framework that would have given ordinary believers the tools to understand and navigate the spiritual realm themselves. They weaponized the spiritual realm as a control mechanism while stripping believers of any real spiritual authority. That is not protecting the flock. That is how you keep the flock dependent. The 16th century and Reformation rolls around and Luther kicks the door in. Calvin, Knox, Huss, and more follow. The Reformation correctly identifies that the institutional church has corrupted the gospel, grace, faith, and Scripture alone. But here's what the Reformers didn't fix, and in some ways made worse. In their very justified pushback against Catholic mysticism, against the excess of spiritual spectacle, against indulgences and relics and the whole apparatus of medieval church power, they threw out more than they should have. The charismatic, spiritually active Christianity of the early church got caught in the crossfire. Reformers were deeply suspicious of anything that looked like mysticism or supernatural experience outside of Scripture, and understandably so, given what they had seen abused. But the result was a theology that was strong on doctrine and weak on spiritual engagement, strong on the Word and quiet about the war. By the time the Enlightenment arrived in the 16 and 1700s, the church had already been softened for 16 centuries. The Age of Reason arrived, and suddenly everything had to have a natural explanation. Educated people started completely dismissing the spiritual realm as superstition, something only ignorant peasants believed. If you wanted to be taken seriously in intellectual circles, you couldn't talk about demons like they were real. So, shamefully, Christianity adapted to be respectable and to not look foolish. demon possession, mental illness. Spiritual warfare, internal psychological struggle. Angels, good thoughts. Demons, bad thoughts. Everything got rationalized, naturalized, and sanitized. By the 1730s and 1740s, we are met with a Great Awakening. This one's a little tricky because the preachers did talk about demons and hell, but they made them distant threats. Jonathan Edwards preached Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, a terrifying sermon about hell and judgment, but it was always about future punishment, about where you were going when you die if you're not saved. The focus became a one-time salvation event. Get saved became the entire message. Lost in that shift, the understanding that spiritual warfare is daily, ongoing, and present. By the 20th century, most mainstream churches had two options: completely ignore the spiritual realm and treat it as embarrassing superstition we've outgrown, or turn it into a charismatic spectacle, ridiculous binding prayers, theatrical exorcisms, treating the spiritual warfare like a magic spell system. Both missed the mark entirely. The majority went down with option A. Don't talk about it. Focus on personal relationship with Jesus, moral living, and church attendance. The spiritual realm either doesn't exist or we don't need to think about it because Jesus already won. Here's the problem. While we were busy making Christianity respectable, rational, Scripture never changed. It still says that the spiritual realm is real, present, and that we are in active warfare. Back to Daniel. When the messenger showed up 21 days after he prayed, he was told, "Your prayer was heard from the first day." But the prince of Persia withstood me for 21 days until Michael came to help me. This is angelic warfare over nations, territorial demonic princes. It's not metaphor. It's intelligence about how the spiritual realm is structured and how prayer does matter. Jude and 2 Peter spoke about the angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode. They've been reserved in everlasting chains under darkness. Angels sinned. They left where they were supposed to be, and now they're imprisoned. Jude directly quotes Enoch. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men. "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all." If Enoch is good enough for Jude to quote in inspired scripture, maybe we should pay attention to what Enoch has to say about the spiritual realm. In Jude 9, Michael and the devil have a dispute about the body of Moses. It shows that archangels and demons interact. They have conflicts over specific things. And even Michael didn't just command, he disputed and contended. The 3 days that Jesus was dead, 1 Peter tells us that he went and preached to the spirits in prison who formerly were disobedient when God waited patiently in the days of Noah. And then there's my favorite, Zechariah. He has a vision of a man among the myrtle trees with horses behind him. An angel explains that these are the ones whom the Lord has sent to walk to and fro throughout the earth. If you think that sounds familiar, it does. In Job, when God asked the adversary, "Where have you come from?" the answer is from going to and fro on the earth, from walking back and forth on it. Same phrase, same function. These are watchers, divine beings sent to patrol the earth and report back to the divine council.
The Hebrew term Hasatan is not a name. It is a job description, a role. He is a prosecutor, an accuser. He's one of the watchers functioning in the divine council system. But for whatever reason, Christianity has turned him into Satan, one ultimate entity of evil. And in doing so, lost the entire framework of how the spiritual realm is structured. We have councils, we have hierarchies, roles, territorial assignments, watchers who remained obedient and watchers who rebelled. Zechariah shows the obedient ones still doing their job. Job shows the adversary still doing his job. Daniel shows demonic princes fighting over angelic princes over the nations. It's all there. We just stopped reading it correctly. Why does any of this matter? Why can't we just ignore the spiritual realm and focus on loving Jesus? Because that's the bottom line anyway, right? Well, when you convince people that demons don't exist or are just metaphors, they stop watching for actual spiritual attacks. They stop taking spiritual warfare seriously, and they become easy targets. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled wasn't convincing the world that he doesn't exist. It was convincing the church that he doesn't exist. When Christians don't believe in active spiritual warfare, they don't recognize when they're under attack, and they don't know how to fight back. They blame themselves for things that are demonic oppression. They become passive victims instead of active warriors. And here's where it connects to church corruption. If you don't believe demons actively work to corrupt the church, then church corruption looks like human failure or bad theology or political maneuvering. You miss that there's an intelligence behind it, a coordinated effort, a demonic strategy that's been playing out for 2,000 plus years. The institutional church didn't just drift into corruption, it was steered by beings who understood that if they could control the church, they could control the message, twist the gospel, and turn people away from God while claiming to represent Him. And the best way to do that is to make sure that Christians don't even believe you exist. So, what do we do to recover? We believe what Scripture actually says about the spiritual realm, not what your seminary-trained pastor who's never read Enoch says, what Jesus said, what the prophets said, what the apostles said. Read the books they don't want you to read. First Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the texts that got removed because they were too explicit about the spiritual realm. No, they are not canon. And I'm not saying that they need to be canon. But they do need to be recognized as something that those who did write the books that are in the canon considered important. And I find it funny how the books that got cut from the canon are the ones that give the most detailed information about demons and spiritual warfare. Understand that we are in a war, not a metaphorical war, not a struggle with our sinful nature, an actual war with actual enemies who have intelligence, strategy, and 2,000 years of experience manipulating humans and corrupting institutions. Learn how spiritual authority actually works. Jesus gave us authority. He said, I give you authority to trample on serpents and scorpions and all over the power of the enemy. But if you don't believe the enemy exists, you'll never use that authority. And finally, stop letting the church sanitize what Jesus actually taught. Jesus was radical. He confronted demons. He gave us tactical information about how they operate. And we've turned all of that into be a good person and go to heaven when you die. That is not Christianity. That is enlightenment moralism with a Jesus sticker on it. The spiritual realm, demons, spiritual warfare, they're all real. The institutional church has been under coordinated demonic attack since day one. That is not conspiracy theory. That is scripture. That is history. And that is reality. If you're tired of sanitized Christianity and you want to understand what scripture actually teaches about the war we're in, come back next week. We are going to dive deeper into how to fight the war, how to recognize the attacks, how to assert the authority, and how to be the best warrior for Christ. Thanks for listening.